Today I ask, can your long-term commitments survive big change? Welcome to Hours for the Making, the channel that explores how to get future fit in an age of uncertainty and short-term thinking. Today I'm going to talk about commitments that reach far out into the future and ask if they can really survive change and what you can do about it. The author Lionel Shriver's book, Should We Stay or Should We Go, is about a couple who make a pact to end their lives at the age of 80. The book then explores 12 different possible plot lines that are set in train by their decision. For instance, what happens if the couple tries to end their lives but the potion only works for one of them? Or what if their kids think that their parents' plan is pretty bonkers and has them institutionalised before the pact is even enacted, and so on. Essentially, the whole book flows from the couple's decision to try and force a certain outcome using something called a commitment device. So a commitment device is a decision that you take in calm mind that fixes you on a particular future path. It's a deliberate attempt to bind your hands. The purpose is to avoid choosing something undesirable in the heat of that future moment. In the couple's case, the future they're seeking to avoid with their commitment device is one where they believe by the pretty arbitrary age of 80, they'll have become an unacceptable burden on family and the state. And besides, they reason, the world will have gone to pot by then and won't be worth living in anyway. So what's a good example of a commitment device? An ancient example of a commitment device is Homer's depiction of Odysseus' encounter with a pair of sirens. Odysseus and his crewmen are sailing for home, but the journey is a treacherous one. The sorceress Circe warns him of the land of two sirens. Anyone who in ignorance hears their alluring voices is doomed, she counsels. Circe advises Odysseus to stuff the ears of his crewmen with beeswax, and that they lash him fast to the ship's mast so that he might listen to the sirens' exquisite music. He takes Circe's counsel. The crewmen's ears are plugged and Odysseus is bound to the mast. He listens to the sirens' haunting melodies and, as predicted, begs to be untied. His crewmen dutifully ignore Odysseus, and their ship sails safely onwards without being lured onto the rocks. The commitment device works. One of the interesting things about commitment devices is that the person using them is perhaps unwittingly baking in at least two pretty big assumptions. One, that the world in the far future will be the same as it is today, or the same as it is predicted. Two, the person using the commitment device expects to feel the same in the future about, well, pretty much everything. They are essentially freezing in aspect the idea that their future self will value the same things and in the same way that they do today, and with the same burning intensity that drove the person to use a commitment device in the first place. These assumptions don't really present issues when the time horizon is short, say for Odysseus and his men. But over longer periods of time, the problems of what I call extended now-sightedness, a belief that today's trends and assumptions will simply continue to hold into the future, they begin to reveal themselves. Psychologists have found that your preferences, outlooks, tastes and so on really do change and continue to change over time, and by more than you imagine. According to research by Dr. Daniel Gilbert of Harvard, people are really quite bad at predicting who they will be in the future. The reason, Gilbert suggests, is simple. It's far easier to remember the past than to imagine the future. We can more readily recall past change, but struggle to imagine change in the future. The result is that we're consistently underestimating how much will alter in the years to come. And the fascinating thing is that regardless of our current age, we seem to hold the erroneous illusion that we've somehow arrived at who we'll be for the rest of our lives. Gilbert and his colleagues call this phenomenon the end of history illusion. Bottom line, your likes, dislikes, proclivities and preferences will not be the same in 10 or 20 years' time as they are today, and they'll probably have changed by much more than you imagine. So what does this mean if you use a commitment device over a longer period of time, perhaps decades? The English philosopher Derek Parfit devised a thought experiment called the 19th century Russian to tease some of these issues out into the open. Parfit imagined a youthful Russian aristocrat, privileged, landed, who firmly wishes to transfer his entire future inheritance to the peasantry immediately at the point in time at which he inherits. The nobleman's reasoning? He fervently believes in socialism, and he fears his principles will wither with age. So by the time he actually inherits, he'll opt to keep the lot. Since his father is relatively young and in good health, the point in time when he expects to inherit still lies some way off. So he draws up a document to be countersigned by his wife. He implores her to uphold his current wishes. This attempt to bind the aristocrat's future hands using a commitment device opens up a whole tin of moral turmoil. In an article for the New Philosopher magazine, the philosopher Patrick Stokes explores the twists and turns that this decision sets in train. Stoke invites you to imagine that in this situation, you're the wife. Decades have passed, the old lord has finally passed, and your husband has inherited his vast estates. He now begs you to overrule that silly document he made all those years ago. Why, he was just a boy really, and what did that callow youth know of the ways of the world? So what should the aristocrat's wife do? Uphold the wishes of her husband's past self, or adhere to the wishes of his present self? Which of her husband's selves should hold sway? The rational young aristocrat, or his rational older self? And what does the wife's decision mean for any future commitments that the couple make to each other? Can your long-term commitments survive change? The challenge for long-term commitments is essentially twofold. 1. The world will change. The world in the future might become unrecognisable, rendering your earlier contract irrelevant, daft, impossible, or dangerous. 2. You will change. You've changed so much as a person that your future self rejects being held to ransom by a decision made years earlier by yourself in your naive youth. So, how can you respond to the central problem of change that the long term exposes in all of our commitments? One option that I quite like is my twist on Stanford forecaster Paul Saffo's process of having strong opinions weakly held. Saffo describes the strong opinion part as to allow your intuition to guide you to a conclusion, no matter how imperfect. So in our context, strong opinions become strong commitments. For the weakly held part of Sappho's process, he recommends that you set out to prove yourself wrong. Engage in creative doubt. After all, why should the aristocrat continue to believe that handing out his inheritance directly to the peasants will achieve his aims of reducing inequality in 19th century Russia? What if, by the time he inherits, there are other more pressing social ills? Is it not reasonable to take another look and check whether his course of action is still wise, or at least consistent with his original intent? On a slight aside, I personally prefer loosely to weakly when it comes to commitments. It strikes me that we choose to hold something loosely, but it's our failing strength that dictates that we hold something weakly. So what might loosely held mean in practice? Perhaps some kind of review, reality check or refresh of your commitments over time. This would at least permit and empower your future self to reevaluate and, if the facts change their mind. And so strong opinions, weakly held, becomes strong commitments, loosely held. What I like about the strong commitments, loosely held approach is that it acknowledges and doesn't just idly ignore this reality that things do change, you change, and unimaginable things, good and bad, can and do just waltz into your life unannounced, upending all that you thought you knew or cared about. So where does this leave all your long-term commitments? Well, we can't just pretend change doesn't happen, so we need some way to accommodate it. So 2 points. First, don't be afraid of forging strong commitments, even if they reach far up the uncertain track of time. 2, remain in creative doubt about whether your original commitment remains valid. If you use commitment devices or have any other good examples, I'd love to hear about them. So pop your thoughts in the comments below. That's it for now. Thanks very much for watching. If you're curious about how to engage more purposefully and positively with the future, subscribe for more and sign up to my weekly email newsletter that digs a little deeper into the ideas that we've talked about today. I'll put a link in the description below. Until next time, remember the future is totally ours for the making.